Well, thank you, former President Barack Obama, for those wonderful words as we go into our story for today. My name is Carrie Chapman Catt, and I'm here today to introduce you to the people who came before you in their fight for equal rights. We will see what planted a seed in their head and watch how that seed grew and nurtured. Eventually, it grew into a huge forest. Then I'll tell you what you can still do to secure the rights for all of us. Now, I am at this point 161 years old, so I will be using my glasses, and we're going to take off my gloves, which I ordinarily would not do, but in order to work through this, I have to use some new equipment. We're going to begin with a word. The word is suffrage. Women's suffrage, and where did that word begin? Well, suffrage came from a Latin term, and it was a term that referred to your place that you voted on. And then the suffragist is really the name that has been accepted. At one point, somebody on the newspaper staff called a group of women suffragettes. And that term has turned out to be a little derogatory, so we're going to get rid of it. The first mention of any part of women's rights happened with a woman by the name of Mary Wollstonecraft. She was a British author. Now, what planted her seed? She wrote a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women, because she was in a school, she was a teacher, and she realized that as the work of a teacher, the girls in her class were not getting the same benefits that the boys were. So she thought that girls needed to have the same educational benefits that the boys did. The idea was that it would become a much better society for everybody, and those ideas in her book were used by the suffragettes who were planning the next phases here. When did that all happen? In 1792. Then, a woman by the name of Marion Kirkland Reed, also an English author, wrote another book called A Plea for Women. She had now what planted her seed. She went to an anti-slavery convention and was forced not to say anything at that convention, and she had to sit in the back, and she decided that this is not a good idea. And she was the first person to state that there was going to be a need for women to have the right to vote. The year of that one, 1843. Our American voice begins with a wonderful woman by the name of Abigail Adams. Abigail was the wife of John Adams. When he left to write the American Constitution, she wrote him a Dear John letter. She wrote, "Dear John, remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to provoke a rebellion, not bound, and we will not be bound by any laws which we had no voice to create." That was a warning. The year was 1776. Now, what did John do when he got the letter? What was John Adams' response? He laughed at her. And then he wrote it. He said, "As to your code of laws, I cannot but laugh. Our struggle has loose bands everywhere. We got a lot of big problems. We have disobedient children. We have disobedient apprentices. We have turbulent schools. We have Indians who have been slighted by their guardians. We have Negroes who are insolent to their masters. We have only the name of a master. And rather than give this up, which would completely subject us to the dictatorship of a petticoat." So, he was going to be no help in this whatsoever. When the United States was born in 1776, In 1775, everybody was equal. They all could vote. I don't know what they were going to be voting on, but they could all vote. In 1777, New York State loses the vote for women. In 1784, New Hampshire loses the vote for women. In 1787, the United States Constitutional Convention puts voting rights into the hands of all the states. It was only New Jersey that kept the women's right to vote until 1807, when they lost the right there too. So at this point, no women in America are able to vote. Now, when the United States Constitution was wanting to write about, well, how should we organize our laws? They went back to some laws which were already written, and they went here. They went to Britain. And this is the British law that the American writers of the Constitution thought, this is a great idea. British law said that the legal existence of the woman is suspended during marriage. It is incorporated or consolidated into that of the husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. They thought that was a great idea. So that's how our laws came. As a result, in 1776, if you were a woman, these were your rights. If you were single, you can have an occupation which did not require a license or a degree. You could enter into contracts, you could buy and sell real estate, purchase stock, livestock, even a slave. You could sue somebody, you could write wills, you could serve as a guardian or an executor of an estate. However, you were relegated to a rather spinster life because women living alone was not okay at that time, and you were highly dependent upon your male relatives, and hopefully they'd be very agreeable to that. If you were married, things changed. You could not sign any contracts, own any real estate, purchase items, you couldn't sue anybody, you could never write a will, you could not serve as a guardian or an executor, you could not get a divorce for any reason whatsoever. You could not keep your family inheritance, any money, property that you, the wife, brought into the relationship, into the marriage, that automatically belonged to your husband. You could not see your children if your husband divorces you. If your husband divorced you for some reason, you got 2 dresses, 1 bed, and a cooking pot, and you were out. Now, with all of this, there was an issue that was way bigger than this. The issue that was bigger than the women's rights movement was the abolition movement. In 1807, no new slaves were allowed to be brought into the United States. Well, that didn't necessarily always occur because there were still many, many slaves here. People thought that this was a Southern institution and the Americans were not speaking out any part of what was going on in the slave issues of the South. The biggest abolition movement happened with a couple of people. A woman by the name of Lucretia Mott. Lucretia Mott is a Quaker. Now that's an important thing to know because in the Quaker religion, their thought is everyone is equal under the eyes of God. With that in mind, it means women have as much as a right to say something as any man. And in their community, that's exactly what happened. Lucretia and her husband lived in Pennsylvania. Her husband was James, and they started out as a school teacher. They were preachers. They ended up opening a shop in Pennsylvania, and that shop said that they will only sell free goods, meaning no goods that were provided by any slave labor was going to be sold in that home. She became a speaker for the entire abolition movement. And in 1840, she was heading to a big convention that was going on not in America, in England. The English people were very receptive to this idea that there was a problem with slavery. Come here and talk about it. When she got to London, she met up with a Henry Brewster Stanton. Henry was a social reformer. He's an attorney, a journalist. He was a politician in New York State, and he was a new husband. He just married Elizabeth Cady, who became Elizabeth Cady Stanton. On their honeymoon, he said, let's go to Europe. They stopped in England, and they ended up at the same convention that Lucretia Mott was. When they attended the abolition meeting in 1840 in London, when they arrived, they spent 2 days with the entire convention explaining and arguing what were going to be the roles of the women who attended. Because originally, they didn't expect to have women there. Well, Lucretia Mott was the woman who was selected to represent her community. She was silenced. So, the decision was made. The women could sit in the balcony, watch what was going on, and not say a word. That was seed number 1. So, in the parlor of the hotel where they were staying, that became a place of high discussion. As a matter of fact, the women were so busy discussing things there that there were a number of people who were staying at that hotel and moved to another hotel to get some peace and quiet when they went down to the parlor. The discussions were long and they were heated. Well, that brings us to Seneca Falls in 1848. Elizabeth Cady Stanton had just moved to Seneca Falls. Her husband's law firm in Boston had closed. They were living in Boston, nice big city. When he didn't have a job at that attorney's office anymore, her father had a little house in a tiny little village called Seneca Falls, and she moves there. When she moved to Seneca Falls, she moves in with 3 children. It's a very small town next to where they were living before, but that town had a number of speakers coming through, and guess who comes in? Lucretia Mott comes to town. Well, they know one another from the convention in London. So they decide to have tea at Mary Ann McClintock's house. And at that little tea, they were discussing what happened at the convention in the fact that they arrived there, they paid their own way, they were elected to be speakers, and they were relegated to the balcony and not be able to say a word. So, they planned at that little tea party a discussion of rights, and they planned the first women's convention. And this is how they did it. They put an ad in a small newspaper. They said, hey, we're getting together. We're coming together in 3 days. Now, at the time in Seneca Falls, there was a big Quaker convention. So there were a lot of people there in this little town, and of course the rest of the people in the town got together too. In order to be prepared for this, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote a speech. She was 33 years old, and she gave the speech to Lucretia Mott to say. And Lucretia said, oh no, Elizabeth, these are your words. You need to say them. So, at that event, Elizabeth presented her Declaration of Sentiments. She wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Sound familiar? She did the exact same thing. She went back to the Constitution. She said, if it works for men, it works for all of us. However, she also ended up making a list of a number of abuses that she saw that were happening in this we are all created equal. I'm not going to give you all of them. We'll be here for 4 days. So, she said a few. First of all, women are asked to submit to laws where she had no voice in creating them. If she is married, she's civilly dead. She can't do anything, own any property, see her children. She has no rights to her own personal property that belongs to her. She is manipulated by the divorce laws who are written against her. All colleges are closed to her. She must obey her husband. It's in the marriage laws. She is stripped of her confidence and self-respect. So she urged the 300 people who were at that convention to sign her petition. Well, she got signatures. 1/3 of the people signed that petition. 68 women signed the petition and 32 men. Now, we're off and running, okay? Some seeds have been planted and now they're going to grow. She was not the only one who was involved in this. Another woman by the name of Lucy Stone started a convention in 1850, a couple years after. She started a national rights convention, and 300 people were at Elizabeth Cady Stanton's. 1,000 people came to Massachusetts, including Susan B. Anthony, who was there not in the suffrage cause. She was there as a temperance worker and got swept into a new idea. Now, Lucy, how did her seed get planted? Well, she was an eloquent speaker and she wanted to go to college for more schooling on elocution and speaking. A college admitted her, but they wouldn't allow her to take any speech classes. So, that was another seed that was planted. Once she was not able to do something she really wanted to do. She did continue. She became the first woman to earn a degree in Massachusetts. She married a man by the name of Henry Blackwell. She was about 18, he's 30. And she asked him to sign a prenuptial agreement. In that prenuptial agreement, she said, since I am in charge of all the children, I'm going to be in charge of the sex as well. They ended up having 2 children, a boy and a girl, and that was it. She also said that she was not taking his name. She was keeping his name, and she was not going to be paying any taxes under things that she had not voted for. What was the year of this? 1830. She then wrote a weekly journal, and she wrote that for about 45 years with her and the daughter. Going back to Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1851, a few years after this convention, well, it was at this point that she runs into Susan B. Anthony. Susan B. Anthony, like I said, is a temperance worker. These are people who were really fighting for the alcohol laws. Alcoholism was, although they didn't call it that, was a huge problem at that time, and it ripped into a lot of families. And Susan B. Anthony was working for that cause. Now, what started her seed? She went to a temperance convention. She said, I would like to speak. And they said, you can't speak, but you could listen. See where those seeds fall again? In 1851, there was another anti-slavery convention over at Seneca Falls, and Susan B. Anthony came back to Seneca Falls for this anti-slavery convention, and she stayed with a woman by the name of Amelia Bloomer. Amelia did attend the first convention in 1848, but she did not sign that petition because religiously she wasn't able to sign it. She married a man who's a lawyer, and they made an agreement. He would stop drinking if she would write an article for his newspaper. She agreed. So she is the first woman to then own and edit a newspaper for women. She called it The Lily. Because she was a working woman, she loved this. It was called a knicker dress. It allowed you to have a pair of slacks and an overskirt. This is very much like American Indians wore, okay? She loved it, she advocated it, and you know it as the bloomer dress. That's why. Now, it was not very well liked. Society didn't like it. It was a big change. As a matter of fact, like I said, it was modeled after what a lot of American Indian women were wearing as their dress, and we have a lot to learn about them. This tribe, the Haudenosaunee tribe, which is a section of the Iroquois tribe, again in central New York, had an interesting setup, and they weren't the only ones. The women of that tribe were in charge of the election or removal of the tribal chief. The women of the tribe made the political, social, economic, and spiritual laws for that tribe. The women of that tribe elected a clan mother, who was their head. The family line of that family went through the mother. All possession belonged to the woman except the hunting and personal items of her husband. She had total custody of her children, and their divorce law was very interesting. If there was a divorce coming up, she took all of her husband's goods, put them out of the tent, and that was it. She went home. So it took the Indian women longer to get an okay to have a vote here in America. They didn't get it until 1924. Now, here are some other people that you should know about because they had seeds planted and helped those seeds to grow. This gentleman is a senator from California. His name is Aaron Sargent. He was the one when Susan B. Anthony wrote up the amendment that we now know of as the 19th Amendment. It was written years before that. It was presented in Congress for the first time in 1878. And this is the gentleman who was willing to do that. It was presented to Congress from 1878 all the way up through when it was passed in 1920 every single year. That's how long it took to have this happen. Another woman is a woman by the name of Victoria Woodhull. In 1872, she ran for president. She was nominated by the Equal Rights Party, and she was the first woman to run for that office. She also, smartly, owned a stock brokerage company with her sister. Now, let's get back to Susan B. Anthony, because those are the people that you remember. Susan, it's interesting to know where the B comes from, okay? Susan, her name is Susan Anthony. She thought, well, this is really too plain, so I need a middle name. So her aunt was married to a man whose last name was Brownell, and she thought, that's a nice name, so I'm going to put that in here. Nobody ever called her Brownell, but she just liked it for an effect. She, too, is a Quaker. Remember what I told you about that. She was the second of 7 children in a Quaker family. She was highly schooled. She went to a boarding school. However, not all programs are open to women, so she was homeschooled for math because the school did not allow her to take any math classes. She was a great organizer and strategist for things. She was great with group work. She's the one who wrote the amendment that was presented to the Congress in 1878. Feisty. She was the first person to use some of the amendments to go out and vote. As a matter of fact, she was even arrested for it. Highly independent. Her father did not pay off her schooling, so she said, fine, I will work, I will teach for a while and pay off my school debt. She was also a very good babysitter. She was the primary babysitter for Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You see, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they had many children. And every time another child was born, Elizabeth Cady Stanton couldn't work for the cause because she had to take care of all these kids. So she brought in Susan B. Anthony, who was the babysitter. She also, was it easy to do that? She never married. And she became the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association from 1892 to 1900. Now, she recruited a lot of other people, including me. She got myself and Dr. Anna Hall involved. And here we are. She said, it is we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who form the Union. Men, their rights and nothing more. Women, their rights and nothing left. Her family had some financial issues. She led a very simple life. She was very frugal, very simple hair, simple black dresses, and that's how she made her life. As far as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Her background is a little bit different, and her seeds were planted in another way. She came from a pretty wealthy family. Her father was an attorney. And as an attorney, he heard a lot of cases of men, women, okay? And Elizabeth Cady Stanton was one of her father's confidants. There were some brothers, but there were no brothers who lived. So because her father was a lawyer, he told her a lot of the cases. For example, she saw a lot of women who were getting divorced who ended up with nothing. She also had a very interesting event happen to her. She had watched an Indian woman across a field meet a white man on a road. They chit-chatted for a little bit, and then they went into a barn. They came out. The man is with a horse. He rides around on the horse. He gets off. He gives her money and rides off with the horse. And she's watching this going, how could that woman do that? So she asked, were you able to do that? And the woman said, it was my horse. Okay? And Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, you owned a horse that you could do that? You didn't have to ask your husband? No, I didn't. You see how the seed is growing here. She went to school. She studied math and science. However, the schools that she could go to were very narrow. She ended up going to the Troy Female Seminary. Highly religious, very tight, turned her totally away from religion. Okay? She, as I said before, married the abolitionist Henry Stanton. He's 10 years older, that's nothing new. When they got married, she said, I am not saying obey. And she didn't. She did not use his name. She did not give up her name totally. She's not Mrs. Henry Stanton. She is Mrs. Elizabeth Cady, which was her original name, Stanton. They had 7 children. And like I said, they needed a babysitter. That was great for Susan B. Anthony. She loved fine food, beautiful clothing, and she was the writer behind the organization. You need somebody who writes all these words and somebody else who can present them. So, our seed is growing. Susan, Elizabeth, and Lucy worked together. Now, they looked very different. You can see how Susan is dressed and Elizabeth is dressed, but they worked together for the rights of women for many, many years. They were also working on the abolition movement, which was a very big part of what was going on in America. Another woman I would like you to be aware of is Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Her family, she was born into a family that was dealing with abolition issues. Her family home was part of the Underground Railroad. She then became an editor for suffrage magazines and newspapers, and she spent 1 year as the president of the National Women's Suffrage Association. There's a Gage effect, where it's called, where women don't get enough credit for what they have done or what they have put forward, and this is where it comes from. She had done a lot of work and never got any credit for it. So today we're giving her some credit for all of her work. Now, what did they do? From 1850 to 1869, the work of the suffrage organizations did the following. In 1863, they established the Women's National Loyal League. That meant black and white women were working together. 400,000 signatures went on to that petition. In 1865, they helped pass the 13th Amendment. They helped abolish slavery because the abolition movement and the women's movement were really hand in hand. In 1866, they established the American Equal Rights Association. We're still working on that. Elizabeth and Susan go to Congress every single year. They speak to the Congress about rights, equal rights, every year and present their same amendment. In 1868, they published a national, not a local, not a state, a national newspaper. It was called The Revolution. What does that tell you? Then, They helped pass the 14th and 15th Amendment. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship. People who were born here are citizens. And the 15th Amendment offered suffrage for men, black men. Okay, so the abolitionist movement moved ahead. So all of that was done with the help of the women's movement. Now, the tactics between the organizations became a challenge. And what they ended up doing was splitting. The National Women's Suffrage Association, under Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, went in their direction. Susan B. Anthony used one of the amendments to say she was able to vote. So she went out and she voted in 1872. 2 days later, she was arrested. She was brought into court and asked, "Do you have anything to say?" And she said, "Yes, I do." And they said to her, "Just be silent." That's another seed. The all-male jury found her guilty. They fined her $200, which is about $2,000 in today's market. And she said, "I'm not paying it." And nobody went after her. The other group, this was a more militant group at this point. The other group, the American Women's Suffrage Association, was under the leadership of Lucy Stone. She had a simpler way of doing things. She wanted to work not with the federal government. She wanted to work state by state. Unfortunately, in the early 1890s, she passed away. She asked her daughter, her last words to her daughter was, "Make the world a better place." Okay? So at 75 years old, she wasn't able to lead that organization anymore. However, at this time, there was a woman who was able to do her first franchise business. Her name is Martha Matilda Hopper, and she franchised a beauty salon, primarily for underserved women, not just black women, but all women who were out in servitude jobs. She trained them how to do this. Susan B. Anthony helped her. A number of people offered her money to support her. She was the first woman to develop a franchise business. Now, it sounds like we're progressing along really well, doesn't it? There were problems. There was an anti-suffrage movement that popped up in the 1870s, passing out pamphlets. Now, it was expensive to do that, to have pamphlets printed and passed out and given out. They said in those pamphlets that women don't want to vote. They're not interested. They don't want to compete with men. Married women vote because their husbands vote, so why bother? This is an added expense for everybody. There are problems. This is going to cost us more time. Now, the biggest threat was not these pamphlets, but the biggest threat to suffrage was the American liquor industry. You see, many times wages were paid not just in money, but in liquor, which meant that by the time you got home, you drank it all, you couldn't go to work the next day, you got fired, your family was destitute. And that's where all this temperance work happened. So and this is a group that did not want women to vote, because what are they going to do? They're going to vote against any liquor laws because the liquor laws are causing them a problem. Does this people have money? Yes, they do. So they were able to support a lot of that. The other threat to suffrage were religious groups. They put a lot of money into those pamphlets, talks, and anything else that was against suffrage. They did not want women involved. Women were not involved in their church services, and they certainly didn't want them involved in anything else. Now, a lot of money came from here. How did the women in the suffrage unit make money? Well, they had women who said, "I will help you. I will give up my fare, my bus fare for the week." That was 15 cents. And that's how they were collecting things. Now, some women got around this by a hat idea. You see, the husbands controlled all of their finances. So a woman would go to a hat store and purchase a hat and say, send the bill to my husband. I'm giving you your hat back. Give me the money for the hat. He'll think that I bought the hat that he's paying for. In reality, you got the hat back again, you could sell it, and I got the money to do whatever I wanted to. This was a very dangerous thing, because when husbands found out about this, you were in deep trouble. But that's how women, some women, especially women at that time who had no control of their own finances, had to work in order to get the money. Another way, they were out looking for it. Look at her little sign, help us win the vote. She's got this little basket. How many of those men back there do you think dropped in a nickel in that basket? Well, the women forged ahead anyway. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton became the National American Women's Suffrage Association president when the two groups came together. And as president, she managed to make a number of changes. She was president for 21 years. She allowed, with her presidency, married women were able to keep their wages if they were out working. Married women won the right to equal guardianship of their children after a divorce. Drunkenness is a cause for divorce. See, all of this is part of what she was dealing with, the seed from listening to her father. And she was able to make some changes. She had a lot of issues. People called her terrible names because of what she was doing. And on one lecture circuit, a man yelled out, "My wife raised 8 sons. That was her most important job." Elizabeth's answer was, "Frankly, I know few men worth repeating 8 times." So she was able to deal with that. In 1887, her husband passed away. She ended up living with a number of children, and she had a number to live with. She retires from the organization around 1890. In 1895, however, her pen is still active, and she writes a Bible. She writes a woman's Bible, which ended up to be a big critique of Christianity. Remember I told you she was in a very tight religious school? Well, this is her way of getting back at them. It challenged the belief that women were subservient creatures in a religious organization, that they were not inferior to them. Well, it caused a big problem, because now she's saying things that's really going to anger a lot of people. So, there were some issues. However, working together, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton made great strides in this whole process. But they weren't around to see it all come to be. Elizabeth Cady Stanton dies in 1902. She was 87. And Susan B. Anthony died a few years later, 1906. She was 86. So we need some new blood to fertilize those seeds. And who comes in? Moving the movement is me, Carrie Chapman Catt. I came into the movement because I was already working with Susan B. Anthony. I had led a national campaign, the local campaign in Colorado. I wrote for the National Suffrage Bulletin that Susan B. Anthony was running. And so I was working with them. They also brought in a Dr. Anna Howard Shaw. She was an ordained Methodist minister and also a medical physician. So we were both brought into this organization, and we led it from the point of when Susan B. Anthony wasn't around anymore. Where did I come from, and who planted my seed? Well, I was born Carrie Clinton Lane, and that's me. I was born in a lovely little home in Ripon, Wisconsin. I was the second of 3 children, and we then moved to Iowa, and when I was about 13 years old. Now, what planted my seed was, my mother was pretty educated, and she's pretty smart. And we were at the house, and a wagon load of men came through to pick up my father, and I said, "Where are you going?" He said, there's an important vote today. We're voting for the next U.S. president. It was when Ulysses S. Grant was being elected president. And I said, oh. I said to my mother, are you going? And my father said, oh no, your mother's not going. Voting is too important a duty for your mother to be involved in. That was the seed. My goal was to become a doctor. My father said, well, you've got a couple of brothers here and their education is more important than yours, so I could give you some money, but not a whole lot. Another seed is planted. I supported myself through school. I was a dishwasher. I was in the library. I was a rural school teacher. I went to a college. I went to Iowa State Agricultural College. There were 6 girls who started in my class of 27 people. There was a debate team there. I thought that would be a lot of fun to be in. I was told I couldn't talk. Another seed. There was a military drill team out there. You know, I came from a very active family. I wanted to be, no, I couldn't do that either. There was another seed. So I started my own debate team with the rest of the girls, and I started our own military drills. When we graduated, when I looked around, I was the only girl left. But I did graduate. I became a law clerk. I worked in a school. I became the first female superintendent of the Mason City Schools in Iowa. I also ended up doing a number of things as a grown-up. I got married. In 1885, I married Leo Chapman. He was a writer. He was off to San Francisco for a job. So I went, okay? So here we are going on this wonderful adventure. He gets to California. Unfortunately, in 1886, the next year, I was widowed. He ended up getting typhoid, and he passed away. Did I come home? No. I stayed there. I became the first female reporter for a newspaper in San Francisco. I then went back to Iowa visiting my family, and I ran into an old school friend. In 1890, I married George Catt. He was in my class. He was an engineer. He designed and built bridges. So he was pretty well off. He knew that I was a busy woman, and I had things that I had to do. And so we had a prenuptial agreement. He said my job was to change the world and his job was to support me. And he gave me 4 or 5 months of the year in order to go and do whatever I needed to do, which was wonderful. So we ended up having a wonderful marriage with that. I became an organizer. In 1890 to 1892, I was a state organizer and recording secretary of the National Women's Suffrage Association under Susan B. Anthony. I was then, 1900 to 1904, I became the president. Susan was much older. At this point, it was a couple years before she passed away, so she helped us get everything underway. It was at that point, in 1905, that my husband George was ill. And from 1905 to 1915, I stepped away from my responsibilities in that organization. George passes away, my mother gets sick. I ended up getting very involved with other things. So I wasn't a big part in the organization. I was doing some traveling. I was in Europe. I was working with some of the women there, but the organization went on and did things without me. One of the things they did is they identified who they were going to be by colors. Our comrades in England decided that they were going to have the colors of the following. You see my little flag here. Their colors were purple, identifying for dignity, white for purity, and green, which was hope of spring. When the American suffragists decided that they needed some colors too, we picked the same purple for dignity and for fighting, white for purity, but yellow or gold was picked because it was the hope of spring. It was a beautiful sunflower, and we thought that that would be our representation. Now, in order to show support, Not everybody was willing to wear a banner like this because they could get you in a lot of trouble. So some people wore a little piece of jewelry, like a pin or a necklace. You could have a bold statement like a lapel clip, but the simplest one was to wear the symbol of a yellow rose. That says you were supporting the issue of suffrage. Now, another way of doing that is in the books. Elizabeth Robbins wrote a wonderful book. She wrote a play, okay? She came from a family life in Kentucky. She ended up becoming an actress. She worked with the Booth Theater, and then she went to England for a while. And when she was there, she ended up chumming around with Ermeline Pankhurst, who was the head of the suffrage movement in England. And she was asked to write a play, which she did. And it became a wonderful parlor reading. That's how people found out what was going on. And in the play, you realize that not all suffragists were these angry, nasty women who were out to cut your head off. Okay, so the play became a very popular thing. There were other supporters who joined the ranks too. Alice Paul. Alice Paul was born in 1885, so she was 26 years younger than I was. She was from New Jersey, Quaker family. Her mother is a suffragist who took her to meetings. She went to college. She got to college because her grandfather co-founded Swarthmore College, so that's how she got in the 1900s. She studied biology. For a further degree, she ended up in England, meeting Emmeline Pankhurst and the suffragists who were working there. And they were a very militant group because unlike our Congress, who would listen to us, not do anything, but listen, their parliament wouldn't even listen. So they were doing some very nasty things. They were destroying businesses, almost like a big protest. You know how people get into that? So Alice was in that. She was arrested several times. She went on hunger strikes. She was force-fed. So she was understanding where all of this was coming. When she came back, she became a part of a very militant wing of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. She wanted to go to Washington. She wanted to interrupt President Wilson in Congress. And at that time, Dr. Anna Shaw was in charge of the organization. She said to Alice, Alice, you want to do this governmental thing? I'm going to give you $10. Go to Washington, see what you, I don't know what you're going to do with $10, even at that time. So Alice Paul took the money and went to Washington to open up her little office. But Alice had friends in high places. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was a friend of hers. She had married William Vanderbilt, who was the grandson of Cornelius. She owned a $3 million mansion in New York and a $9 million mansion in Newport. When she divorced William, she married Oliver Belmont. Belmont Steaks, okay? She then brings Christabel Pankhurst to the United States. Christabel is Emmeline's daughter. So she gets involved in the suffrage movement, and it is her money that is given to Alice, and she establishes a Belmont house in Washington, D.C. for Alice and her organization to work out. You know, sometimes you need friends in high places in order to get high places. In the National Party, they decided to, in the party along with Alma and Alice, they had big plans. And it ended up, well, she was the president of the National Women's Party, but this is what they had a big plan for. In 1913, on March 3rd, the day before Wilson was going to be inaugurated as president, they had a big parade. Now, this is an expensive venture to do. They got Inez Milholland to be the leader of the parade. She was a lawyer, an activist, a beautiful lady. They got her a beautiful white horse, a stunning outfit, and she led the parade. The parade was held in Washington, D.C. 8,000 women marched in the parade. They brought in banners and floats. They were organized into groups. If you were a social worker, you were here. If you were a nurse, you were here. Everything started, everybody was covered. Homemakers were in the parade. A contingent of black suffragists led by Ida B. Wells, wonderful woman. They were also in the parade. Unfortunately, they were relegated to the back of the parade, which is a whole other story, but they were there. Now, the parade starts out in Washington pretty orderly. It's a pretty well organized thing. However, the crowds around them, you see mostly wearing derby hats here, were drinking a little bit. They were taunting them, and pretty soon, this is what the parade route looked like. The parade marchers were surrounded by the people who were watching the parade. They couldn't get any further. Horrendous chaos, almost like a big protest. 100 people were injured, no arrests were made. The police chief was fired after that, but the event made the papers, and it got a lot of publicity for the organization. At that point, in 1915, I came back into the organization. I had dealt with my family issues. I had dealt with some international things that I was dealing with, and the organization said to me, "Help! Okay, we're in trouble. This parade has cost us trouble, and even though this is a wonderful lady, Anna Howard Shaw was a wonderful lady, she just lacked the organizational skills that we needed to get ahead, so we're moving her out, and I'm in." Well, I came in with money as well. I got a $2 million gift from Miriam Leslie. Her husband was the editor and publisher of a New York magazine, so she gave me that money in order to move the organization forward. And we had a lot of work to do. As of 1915, the blue states had voting rights before the federal amendment. Those people in those states, but see where they were? You're in the West, okay, but you could vote. If you were the gray states in the upper area, you had full voting rights before the amendment and before you had statehood. So all those people, all the women in those states could vote. If you were in green, those people, the women there could only vote in presidential elections, only, nothing else. If you were in orange, no way were you ever close to having a vote. Now, because we had all that work to do, I had a very different idea of how we were going to get this done. I said, we need to work state by state. We have tried the federal government since 1878, nothing has happened. So let's go state by state. We're going to have parades, yes, but we are going to be parading in our Sunday dress, Sunday best, hats, flowers, very organized in every state. We're going to have very organized and coordinated signs, posters, and petitions. Now, with that in mind, Alice Paul says, I'm out of here. She forms her own organization. She forms the National Women's Party in 1916, and the more militant people ended up there, including Alma Vanderbilt Belmont, who paid for a lot of the things that they were having. Their idea was, we need to pressure the government. How did they do that? In silent sentinels. They picketed in front of President Wilson's White House from dawn to dusk for 18 months. And at that time, this was the first time a political party in power was blamed for this injustice. They said, it is your fault. It is your political party that has changed things or has prevented women from being able to vote. This is also the first nonviolent civil disobedient protest on the sidewalk of the White House. Now, unfortunately, this is happening during wartime. We had just entered World War I. And by picketing the White House for your own little concern, they came off as traitors. So it wasn't a very good result of this. As a matter of fact, it was such a nasty thing for them to do that they were arrested. 500 women were arrested and put in jail. They were fined $10 a day for every day that they stayed in jail, which is about $250 in today's market, in today's money. 168 stayed in jail because they wanted to be a political prisoner, which meant you could keep your own clothes, you had a separate cell, you could have visitors. As a result, they were sent to the Occoquan workhouse in Virginia, which still stands today. There, a number of women, including Lucy Burns and Alice Paul, were jailed as criminals. They were put in prison garb. They ate worm-infested food. The toilet was flushed by a guard controlling that at the outside of their cell whenever he felt that that toilet should be flushed. Their blanket was washed once a year. They had 1 pail of water per cell, 1 bar of soap, 1 cup to share. They had no visitors. Alice Paul decided that this was criminal. She went on a hunger strike, as well as Lucy Burns, whose picture is here. Because of that, Lucy was able to smuggle out a couple of ideas about what was going on, and the people in America were up in arms. They said, don't treat these women as criminals. The response of the jail was as follows. After the hunger strike that Alice Paul went on, of course she had done this in England, she was force-fed. A tube is pushed up her nose and then forced into her stomach, and she is force-fed along with Lucy Stone. They were force-fed a combination of raw eggs. They were fed that way until they vomited. They were treated as if they were insane, but she refused to give in, and she did not give in. And then all hell breaks loose. November 14th of 1916 is known as the Night of Terror. That night, 40 guards attacked 33 women in the Occoquan warehouse. The women were grabbed, beaten, choked, violated, and slammed to the floor. Lucy Burns had her arms over her head, chained that way all night. Upon their release, eventually they were all released. This is where they ended up. Right back at the White House, in the picket line. 2 years later, the women they charged, the courts for being illegally arrested, and the courts said you were. They said that the arrests were illegal, but the women didn't get any reparations for that. And there's nothing in the history books about it. Now, this brings me back into the organization. In 1916, I am back there. All of this mess is happening with Alice Paul. The organization doesn't have a way to go, so I came in and I said, we have got to go in the right direction. What I ended up doing in 1917 is I made sure that I supported the war. We pulled back on what we were doing. We supported what was going on, because that was a patriotic thing to do. We said, we're going to take our women and we're going to make sure that you have enough nurses in uniform. We're going to take our women and we're going to put them in the working places for the men whose factory jobs you have lost, either in the factory or on the farm. We will take over those jobs. And because of that, we made some progress, although we had some problems. The progress that we made is I developed something called the winning plan. In that plan, we were going to work with every state to make sure that those representatives agreed with suffrage. One of the problems came up in 1918. We had a flu epidemic. I got sick. You know what happened to that? No assemblies. Everybody had to have a face covering. You couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't do anything. We were relegated to working on the phones. I hope this never happens to you again. We had to write newspaper articles because of the flu epidemic. Then, In 1918, the amendment was put up to the government again, and it loses by 2 votes. This is the same amendment that's been going on since 1878. 2 senators from the South voted no. The reason that they voted no is because they were afraid of the black women voting interrupting their role in white supremacy. Then, in January of 1920, the amendment is put up again, and it loses by 1 vote. President Wilson got up in front of the government, in front of the legislature, and said, listen, during the war, these women stood up for us. They worked in the factories, they worked the farms, they became the nurses. We have got to give them something back for all the work that they have done. And I said to President Wilson, you better work with me, because otherwise you'll be working with Alice Paul, and you don't like what she's doing. So, after his talk to the Congress and my talk with him, a few months later, in June of 1920, the amendment is passed. We're not finished. It needs to be ratified by 36 states. So we were off. How are we going to get these states to do it? Well, in the summer of 1920, 35 out of 36 states voted and ratified the amendment. We needed 1 more state. There was only 1 state that was willing during that summer to have a new bill passed. It was the state of Tennessee. So I got my entire outfit and went to the state of Tennessee in the dead of a summer. I expected to be there about 2 weeks. We were there 2 months. They held a special session. So we set up our people there, and we met a man by the name of Henry Byrd. He was a representative, a young man in Congress, and he came into that meeting wearing a red rose, which meant no suffrage vote for me. He was led by his party to vote that way. He was told by his party, you wear this red rose or we're not backing you again. He was also given some misleading information from he thought, constituents. He was getting all these letters from people that were not real people asking him to not vote for suffrage. So he was kind of being pulled in that direction unfairly. That morning that he left for a final vote, his mother, Feb, and there she is, wrote him a note. She said, dear son, be a good boy today and vote for suffrage. With lots of love, Mama. When he got to the chamber, he read the note, and the red rose came off, and the yellow rose came on, and we got the perfect 36. So we got our 36 states. We moved along quickly. In August, both houses of Tennessee ratified that amendment. The anti-suffragists attempted to disrupt that vote. They called it illegal. They said you didn't do it correctly. A number of people in Tennessee, in that congressional office, left the area so that they wouldn't have a quorum to disrupt that vote. In August of 1920, the Speaker of the House signs it, and here we are. We have a constitutional amendment, and that's the signing of that amendment, and we made the papers, okay? August 26th of 1920, the United States Constitution adopts the 19th Amendment. 8 million people were able to vote that following November election. And by this time, all of our seeds have been nurtured, grown, and we now have a forest. It took 144 years from all of this to happen. All the changes that all these people were working on. Now, what was I doing? Well, I was thrilled, okay? I went back to New York. I was greeted by all my friends. I got this beautiful bouquet. I had supervised dozens of campaigns, organized millions of volunteers, hundreds of speeches. Now, I kind of tell you, I'm not proud of everything I said. I'm almost embarrassed. I was a woman of the time in which I lived. In some cases, it's not very nice. I insulted Elizabeth Cady Stanton for her Bible. I said, you had a lot of nerve to write about that. I insulted the Indian tribes for what they were doing. I said terrible things about immigrants. They had no business coming here and getting, if you were a man, as an immigrant, you came here, you didn't even speak the language, you could vote. Okay, I was terribly against that. I was terribly against that, and then I made sure that the southern states realized that they were going to still keep their white supremacy. I am terribly embarrassed by this, but it was just the times in which I lived. Now, where is the suffrage amendment now? Well, it's been an interesting couple of years since it finally was signed in 1920. Alice Paul finished her law degree. She got a doctorate in 1923. In 1923, she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment and presented it to Congress. It was not passed. It was the same amendment that was then passed in 1964, and I can tell you that she's the one who wrote that you should not be denied a position because of sex. And that word played a very important role in 2020 as another passage of this Equal Rights Amendment happened. It was because of her word. It was presented yearly, and Alice never lived to see all of this happen. She began a women's party for the League of Nations. She was working with that. She was the chairperson of a big world party. In 1964, she wrote the Civil Rights Act that was finally adopted. At the age of 92 in 1977, she passed away. In her honor, however, in 2012, a coin was developed in her honor. The Belmont House is open for visitors in Washington, D.C., and this is going on in 2020 or 2021. There's going to be a big memorial at that Occoquan workhouse where she was arrested and force-fed, and there'll be parts of that in her honor. So thank you very much, Alice, for everything that you have done. Now, what did I do after the amendment? I was still working because I still believed that service to the community was very important. And I continued my work. I did resign from being the president, but I founded something else. This is mine. I realized that we were going to have millions of women voting who had no clue about what to do. So my League of Women Voters was established before the amendment passed. I put this together in January of 1920, 6 months before the passage. It is nonpartisan, it is educational, and it's a women's organization, although men are free to become part of it. I continued my international alliance and working for international suffrage with people. I did a lot of peace work. I was working for Jewish refugees, child labor protection laws, and you know, I was recognized for some of my work too. Look at this, I'm on the cover of Time magazine, who would have thought? And then I got lots of honors and accolades for what I had done. In 1941, a friend of mine, Eleanor Roosevelt, presented me with a nice award. I lived in a beautiful home in New Rochelle, New York. I wrote a book. I wrote the inner story of the women's suffrage movement, and well, before you know it, I passed away. I died of a heart attack in 1947. I am buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. My husband, George, his body was given to science. My husband, Kat, was buried in California, so I ended up in the Bronx. In 1948, a couple years after I passed away, the United States government came out with a wonderful stamp who honors Elizabeth Cady Stanton, myself in the middle, and Lucretia Mott for 100 years of the work on the women's rights movement. My childhood home, would you believe it, is now a tourist attraction. Iowa University has a new building called the Carrie Chapman Camp Center for Women in Politics. My letters and clothing are at Bryn Mawr College, who would have thought. And then, most recently, in 2013, I was the first woman honored on the Iowa Women's Achievement Board in a bridge in Des Moines. And in 2016, they did a whole statue commemorating Women's Equality Day, and I'm the one who's standing on the left. Now, you think the struggle is over? Not by a long shot. It took years for some states to ratify the amendment. Look at what happened. This is how long it took for states to ratify the amendment that was passed in Mississippi didn't ratify it until 1984. Now, does that mean that they didn't allow women to vote? Well, not really. I mean, but they could have poll taxes and do whatever they could. And you notice it's a lot of southern states again. If we go back to 1915, it was those states in the South that created the biggest problem forever. Now, perhaps all of this could have been avoided if, instead of laughing, Mr. John Adams would have listened in 1776. This has been a 243-year struggle for equal rights. And at the 2019 State of the Union, we are still marching and walking and wearing white. Today, in the stories we share, we honor those who took a stand, like the movers. Susan B. Anthony, this is her grave on Election Day. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, same thing. And of course, the Shakers. Alice Paul, she not only gets stickers, she gets notes for whatever she did. March is Women's History Month. So the National Women's History Alliance always honors women. For 2020, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw is being honored. I'm on the honor list, and so is Lucy Burns. In honor of those who walked, who fought, who were choked, who spoke out while they were being ridiculed and they risked their job and their families, those who gave up their bus fare, let us remember, women did this for us. And we could do one thing for them, and that is vote, as if your life depends on it, because it does. Because the way of life that we want today depends on it. Every one vote, every one voice counts. Just think of the important effect of two little notes. One that was laughed at, and one that was listened to. Finally now, we will remember the ladies. The fight is not over. I'm going to leave you with the words that I lived by. This is to the wrongs that need resistance, to the right that needs assistance, and to the future in the distance. Give of yourself. Thank you. Keep on voting, and keep on remembering the people who did so much to get us where we are today. These are for all the women that we have ever known. May we know them, may we raise them, and may we be them. Thank you very much.